Hello, Endeavour here. So we're back here. I'm here with Morgoth tonight, and we're back with our next episode of Morgoth and Endeavour's classic movies. And tonight we're talking about a film that I really enjoy, and I think it really is an important film for our time. We're talking about Dr. Zhivago. This is the second David Lean movie that we're covering, and this one it has a lot of very interesting themes, which we have a lot to get into. So, how are you doing tonight, Morgoth?
I'm doing great. It's a lovely, frosty and frozen landscape out here in Northumberland. So I kind of wandered the fields, and I kind of felt a bit like Dr. Zhivago. That I was pretending a little bit in my mind when I was out earlier.
Yeah. So, if anyone who doesn't has not seen the movie, I'll give a short summary of the plot of the movie. So the setting is. It takes place in revolutionary era Russia. So the film begins in the Russian Empire, and it tells the story of a fictional man named Yuri Zhivago. He's a medical doctor by practice, but he's a poet, and poetry is his passion. And it's about his life through the revolutionary years in Russia. So when the film starts, it starts as he's a young boy, and he's adopted by a wealthy family living in Moscow. And he begins to practice medicine in 1913 in pre-revolutionary Moscow. He's a doctor. He's just become a full doctor, and he's a really successful physician. But poetry is his passion, and he's best known for his poetry. But then the war breaks out in 1914, and he was just engaged. He had just gotten married to his foster parents' daughter. And before he's shipped off to the war, and she has their first child. But then, things take a lot of twists and turns for Zhivago. He goes off to the war, where he's a doctor in the military, in the what's called the field hospitals. And then the revolution comes, and what happens then is he is stuck in this role. He's not really a very political guy. He's not like a revolutionary, nor is he really a staunch supporter of the Tsar. But he eventually returns to Moscow, where after the Bolshevik Revolution in October, November of 1917 has taken place. So once communism has just started, he's back in Moscow, and he finds that he's out of favor with the new Bolshevik party because his poetry they deem to be subversive. They deem his work to be anti-communist, and he's forced to flee to the Urals. When he's there, he meets with a nurse who he had worked with in the field hospital, and he has a love triangle between his wife and this new woman he meets, and then eventually he's dragged into the Civil War, and the film ends with him as returning to Moscow and beginning his medical practice again, where he dies in the early Soviet period of a heart attack. And the film is really about. I think that the most important thing of the film is kind of what's going on inside of Zhivago. It's a very internal story, and about the way that he sees the world, and the way that he expresses that through his poetry. And I'd say that ultimately it's a film about maintaining one's humanity through the worst of times. And I truly enjoy it for that reason. That's why I think it's one that, as we'll discuss here, it's one that's very relevant today. So I'll let Morgoth in here. So, Morgoth, what would you like to say about Zhivago to start off?
Well, I think it's a David Lean movie as well. So the first movie that we looked at was Lawrence of Arabia, and everybody will remember that kind of what we talk about quite a bit with Lawrence of Arabia was David Lean's cinematography, where he just loves the grand landscape and how vast open vistas, as they say. And in Dr. Zhivago, like, he really goes to town. I mean, there's parts in it where Zhivago is literally just like a tiny little speck in this endless snowy wasteland. He loves it. Even it begins like that with the Urals as a backdrop. So it is like a grand, sweeping, romantic opera, isn't it? It's gigantic. I mean, the DVD that I had, it's sliced in two, and there's even got an intermission in the middle of it. But all in all, it runs at nearly 4 hours, and it stretches like from one end of Russia to the other, pretty much. You go everywhere. It's huge. Just the sheer size of the movie needs a bit of commentary, I think. It's massive. You go from like the Western Front, from the Russian perspective in World War One, all the way like through Siberia, and then also down into the Urals, and then of course into Moscow, and you see all of the landscape. It's beautiful to look at, but it is like such a scale.
Yeah, and one thing that's interesting to note is that the novel that it's based on, which unfortunately I haven't read yet, but we're discussing the film for the purposes of this stream. The novel, and along with the film, which came out in 1965, was banned in the Soviet Union, and they actually were not allowed to film in the USSR. So most of the film was shot in Spain. One thing I've noticed about the movies we've reviewed so far, 3 out of 4 of them have all been shot in Spain. So it's a testament to the landscape there, and it's very interesting that David Lean can make he can make Spain both the Russian Empire, or he can make it Ottoman Arabia, which is pretty impressive. But yeah, definitely one aspect of the film is the landscape. It's very beautiful, and it's really important for the story because Zhivago is a man. He seems to see the beauty in nature, the beauty in humanity everywhere. And he's able to express it through his poetry. One thing that the film, you never actually read any of his poetry. It never actually gives you an example of it. But I think maybe that might be better left unsaid because it expresses what's going through his mind through the imagery of the film, through his scenes of Zhivago walking across a very like a snowy wasteland in Siberia, or him staring out a frozen window in the middle of winter, or standing in the fields of flowers, and you kind of like get a sense of what's going on through his mind. What are the emotions that he is expressing through his poetry, and that's kind of how the film presents that. I think that it's important to talk about the character of Zhivago first because it really is a film about him. It's about his experience. He's a very poetic man, a very deep thinker, and he really just loves humanity. And through he goes through the best and the worst that he goes through the best of times and the worst of times that history has to offer through the film. But one thing is that throughout the entire film, he maintains a healthy soul. He remains a very happy man. Maybe except for the scenes where he's off in this fighting in the Civil War, or he's just like almost dying of hypothermia in the middle of the Urals. Other than that, he's pretty much happy and content with every situation that he finds himself in. So, what would you say about the character Zhivago, and how would you describe the way that he looks at the world?
Well, Zhivago is a romantic, and what Pasternak's done and Lean has done. So it's similar to Lawrence of Arabia in that respect as well. Zhivago is like an old-fashioned romantic or an idealist, and so he kind of wanders and blunders through life. I mean, he doesn't have any kind of master plans, and he doesn't. To be honest, there's some aspects to his character. I don't know how this is addressed in the book, but we have to be honest. He does like cheat on his pregnant wife. And even Lara, who we can come on to, isn't exactly perfect either. So it's kind of mature because they aren't perfect characters at all. And I think the purpose of Zhivago and the all of the characters really is that they are human. I think that's they are flawed. They aren't these perfect specimens of goodness and moral virtue and all of this. They are flawed in their own way. But Zhivago is basically the quintessential romantic, and he wanders around through life just always thinking with his heart. And of course, this is where then offset with the Bolshevik Revolution going on in the background. And you get the sense, and it's told to him as well quite a few times, especially by his half brother. And you get the sense that he's kind of wandering around with a noose around his neck because his starry-eyed view of life, the appreciation of beautiful things, and he can like stare at an icicle for ages, and then he looks up at the moon when he's on the train. This isn't going to fit in well in the sort of what's coming in, which is Marxist materialism, and I think that's why it's been kind of set like that. I think that's what Pasternak was trying to do. Like, where is the place for these kinds of people in their worldview? That's kind of what the film's trying to do. But I mean, the issue of the love story aspect to it, and that I don't know. I mean, it makes you kind of uncomfortable the way that was. The way that he did kind of just cheat on a pregnant wife. I mean, that's kind of hard to defend. What would you say about that?
Yeah, I mean, he's certainly not a perfect character. I mean, he's morally flawed in that regard, definitely. But I'd say that my take on it was that he kind of like went through all this kind of hardship throughout his life during this period. But he was kind of able to maintain, like I said, maintain a healthy soul. When you look at where he starts in the movie, he's a prestigious doctor in Moscow in 1913. A father to be, a newly married man, and he's basically, and also not only that, poetry is his passion, and he had just been named one of the greatest up and coming Russian poet by a French newspaper, and basically the life is as good for him as it can be. But then he goes through first the First World War. And then returning to Moscow, having his entire life taken away from him. And then he eventually, because there's a great scene where, we'll get into this one later, but there's this great scene where he goes into his house and it's been repossessed. There's like 13 families living there now. And then after that, he's in the Urals, he's living in this cottage with his new family. Then he's in then he's conscripted into the Red Army. And one thing I thought was really fascinating, though, was at the very end of the film, Zhivago had lost not one but two families. He had lost his wife, he had lost Tanya and the two children that they had together, and he had also lost Lara. She was taken away, and then he didn't see her again until the very last scene where the last scene of the movie, he sees Lara while he's riding on a streetcar and gets off to try to say hi to her and to get her attention, but then he has a heart attack and dies in the street, and she never sees him. But what was interesting, though, was the scene where Alec Guinness's character, this is his half brother. It's Yevgraf Zhivago. So he's Yuri Zhivago's half brother, and he's actually a communist commissar, a communist police officer in Moscow. And what was interesting was that he said that despite all that, Zhivago was a happier man than him. As he's this homeless, impoverished, starving man on the streets of Moscow, who his brother helps him get a job at the hospital. But it seems like, I guess my interpretation of how, I guess the immorality of Zhivago is that, he is a very human man. He goes through he goes through a lot of the worst, but ultimately in all that, he's able to maintain happiness. But of course, when you go through the human emotions that people go through, of course, no one's perfect. So he, himself was a sinner, but ultimately at the end, he was able to maintain that poetic view of society.
I mean, I think it's worth taking a look at some of the other characters as well before we jump into the deep stuff, because I think of the movies that we've covered so far, Dr. Zhivago is the most political. So that you have to kind of get through the characters and then get to give some context. So I'd say that after Zhivago, then you've got Lara, who's this beautiful young blonde woman who works for, a bit of a shady character, and she works in his shop, I think it is. And again, like it gets quite uncomfortable because she actually gets raped by Kamarovsky, who is like a man completely without any moral compass at all. He's just out for himself, and he always seems to survive. He keeps turning up because he'll just do whatever it takes. He's this kind of Machiavellian figure. But I mean, again, it's kind of uncomfortable because he actually rapes Lara at the start of the movie. And he does it, and he says, because there's two kinds of women in this world. There's what is it? There's good women and there's sluts, and you are a slut. And then he rapes her. And then you think, well, this is dodgy. And then she kind of doesn't put up much of a fight and ends up cuddling him while he's raping her. And it's, again, like it's quite harsh, but it's this unflinching look at people in as they actually are. And I know that's controversial these days, but the fact is she's like the main woman of the whole movie, and she's flawed as well. She's certainly not some kind of pure angel, but at the same time, it isn't like Once Upon a Time in the West, where everybody's just broken and everybody's cynical. It's not like that. They've nevertheless still got a kind of romantic view of life.
Yeah, with Lara, the other thing is that she almost causes her mother to commit suicide. Her mother attempts to commit suicide, hearing that her daughter is in an affair with Kamarovsky. And so this guy is like some chubby guy, like businessman in his mid 40s or 50s or something. He's known for scamming people. He's a ruthless businessman. He basically fleeced Zhivago's family in the will. So when Zhivago's father died when he was young, Kamarovsky fleeced him and took away a huge portion of their wealth. And he's in a relationship with in 1913. Lara's 17 years old, so he's in a relationship with a 17-year-old girl. And what I said about Kamarovsky is that he's an archetype that we see a lot today. He actually reminds me of he reminds me of a lot of these very powerful politicians, someone like Joe Biden or someone like maybe Justin Trudeau or Boris Johnson, because he has no ideals whatsoever. There's a great line in the movie that after Lara attempts to kill Kamarovsky by shooting him after she was raped by him, Zhivago is patching him up the bullet wound, and what he says to Zhivago is, "I don't agree with the Bolsheviks, but I maintain many contacts with them." And he says, "Do you want to know why?" Zhivago says, "Why?" He says, "Because they might win." So with Kamarovsky, he's just a complete Machiavellian realpolitik character, much like a lot of these politicians today who, they know that kind of the whole woke progressivist worldview. I think a lot of them don't genuinely believe in it, but that's like their pathway to power now. So with someone like Joe Biden, this is a guy who has basically just blown with the political winds his entire career and been very, very successful with that. About a couple decades ago, a lot of people will say that, he was friendly with segregationists in America. Now he's like spewing out these talking points, which was created by someone who's like 40 years younger than him. I mean, that's like what Kamarovsky is, because as it turns out, he ends up being a Bolshevik, a completely disingenuous one, because at the start of the film, he sarcastically says about the leftist protest in Moscow, they'll sing in tune after the revolution, meaning like, he doesn't take it seriously. But then toward the end of the film, he's actually not only an officer in the army, in the Red Army, he's actually like a hitman for them to go out and then take out the political enemies. So, he's basically someone who's out for himself and himself only.
Yeah, he'll just side with the winning team. And so what's interesting is that at this point, we can also introduce the last of the main characters, and that's Pasha. And so he's this real dyed-in-the-wool, like Marxist ideologue. And so what you end up with, I mean, everything that comes out of his mouth is just ideology. So what you end up with is a kind of triad where you've got Zhivago as the romantic, and then you've got Kamarovsky, who's just like the sort of pragmatist, and then you've got at the other end, the third part of that triangle would be Pasha as the ideologue, and then Lara is in the middle of them all, pretty much. And I think this sets much of the tension of the whole saga.
Yeah, and I think that it's also important to, because one thing I've noticed is the different like kind of archetypes of the left, like kind of like the videos that you've made. A lot of them are represented in this film. So there's, as I mentioned, Kamarovsky. He's the cynical one. He's the one who just sees it as his route to power, and is the realpolitik Machiavellian that is just interested in taking power. Then there's Pasha, who's the true believer. He's like, if Kamarovsky is like the Joe Biden of the day, he's Pasha's like the Antifa supporter. He's like the guy who's going to be out on the street and he's going to beat you up for wearing a MAGA hat or whatever. He just lives and breathes leftist ideology. And then we can get into this guy later, but with Yevgraf, so Zhivago's half brother, he actually seems like somewhat of a good man. But we'll get on to him because with Pasha, I actually am of the opinion that he's actually even worse than Kamarovsky, because I mean, toward the end of the film, Kamarovsky has an ounce of humanity. He has an ounce of sympathy for Lara and Zhivago. But with Pasha, I mean, I think that what I said in my notes was that he's probably the best portrayal of a modern day leftist I've ever seen in a movie, because essentially he's a radical leftist determined to bring down all of traditional Russian society in a socialist revolution. But what's important to note about him is that he doesn't really he doesn't really love the blood and sweat and flesh of the Russian proletariat. He supports the proletariat as a concept, and what you'll see later in the film is how much he brutalizes the Russian peasants. I mean, Pasha he's driven to left-wing politics because he's essentially a loser. He's not working class. He's a middle-class intellectual, but one who's really incompetent and one that lacks any kind of confidence. And he kind of sees leftism as his outlet to lash out against the traditional Russian society that he has no part in. Now, I'd be remiss if I didn't say that the history of the Bolshevik Revolution is very dicey. And, there's a lot of it that has been buried. And I definitely recommend Mark Weber's essay on a certain group's role in the Bolshevik Revolution. But I thought that both Kamarovsky and Pasha were very, very, very tribal characters, so to say. They weren't in the script. They weren't actually referred to as this other ethnic group. They were referred to as Russians. But the characters themselves, I have to say, you do really see them in those characters.
Yeah, and on that sensitive subject, Pasternak himself got into some trouble on his thoughts on that particular group, and I think Kamarovsky's definitely of that stripe, but he isn't the ideologue. He's the realist. I mean, the degree to which the let's say the people you're talking about would be that ideological is up for discussion. I think that tends to be. That would be a kind of Russian, even though most of them weren't Russians, and they weren't just one other group either. There was a whole hodgepodge of them round up. The actual ethnic Russians were, I think, it was barely scraped 50% of the party. The commissars and all of this. But I think Pasha is of a certain kind who is just absolutely like soulless, and there's nothing there but the text. Like when Jonathan Bowden went on, where they've got nothing there but the text and the theory, and that's everything. Whereas Kamarovsky is just a realist. And so if you contrast Kamarovsky to the Pasha as the ideologue, you'll find that in the realist can actually care about things. The cynical realist may well have a heart of gold. It's just he's cynical about the whole world. And when it comes down to it, he may well melt and think, well, I've got to try and get the girl out because they're going to shoot her, even if I've got to kind of stick my neck out. It's sort of the Han Solo type, where, yeah, I'm cynical about the world, but when it comes down to it, I will try and do an act of good. But the ideologue has nothing. They're just in a void, just nothing there at all.
Yeah, and so with Pasha's character, at the beginning of the film, we see him in pre-revolutionary Moscow. He leads a leftist protest, which is quashed by the Tsarist police. And then, Lara does not love Pasha. She only uses him as her way to escape Kamarovsky. So she says that she'll marry Pasha and move to the Urals with him. But then we don't see him for quite a while after that. Throughout the entire, I mean, he fights in the war. We see him going off to the war. But then what you hear about in the film is that there's this red general called Strelnikov, and he's this ruthless killer, and but the men love him for, or at least like the Red Guard love him because of how brutal he is and how effective he was. And what you find out later is that Strelnikov is actually Pasha. That wasn't his real name. And there's a scene when after Zhivago is forced to flee from Moscow and go to the Urals, he travels through a village which has been completely ransacked. The village has been like burned to the ground. People have been massacred. There's like dead bodies, and there's this woman who is running to get on the train. She has a baby in her hand, and you find out that she was only holding the baby so that the baby was a corpse that wasn't even her own child, and she just uses that as the way to get on the train. But she tells them that Strelnikov, who's actually Pasha, had massacred the entire village because there was a rumor that they were selling horses to the White Army. And what's interesting, though, is that according to this woman, it wasn't true. And Zhivago later actually comes face to face with Pasha, and he confronts him about this. First, we find out that Pasha has left Lara. He's not interested in ever seeing her again because he puts the revolution, the ideology above his own family, above his wife, and he puts it above all the individual life. He actually says the individual life is now dead. History has killed it. And that's why he doesn't like Zhivago's poetry. But also another thing that's interesting is that what Zhivago says to him is how could you kill this entire village of people? And he says, well, they were selling horses to the whites. They deserved it. And it's important to remember that this is the guy that claims to be a champion of the working class, a champion of the peasants, a champion of the poor. And he says that, well, even if they didn't sell them, it sends the message. And Zhivago replies, your message, their village. And I think that perfectly sums up the left today, because it's all ideology with them. But, in terms of the actual flesh and blood, they have just outright contempt for it.
It's interesting and a bit funny that every time Zhivago comes into contact with the Communist Party or the Bolsheviks, they always say the exact same thing about his poetry. They all say it's something like petty bourgeois sentimentality or something. They use the exact same phrase, whether it's his half-brother or whether it's Pasha. It's as if this is how we have to describe poetry, and especially Zhivago's poetry. So it's just they don't even take into account what it has to say. They've just got a party line about how to describe it, and then that's it. And of course, Strelnikov Pasha, he literally kind of just goes around in the train torturing and wiping out villages. And I think it's interesting that you can see whenever the way they actually treat the people in the countryside, they're just animals. They're just absolute savages. And yet this is supposed to be the ideology, of the farmer and of the working class, of the peasant, the proletariat. And you can see that in actual fact. It's actually just a sort of metropolitan urban thing, which comes from Moscow and then imposes itself and terrorizes the entire population. I mean, it's a bit of a tangent and early in the stream, but you'll notice that the movements which have sprung up around, and the thinkers which were writing, which were against Marxism and Bolshevism in particular, they always kind of sprung from the countryside and from the more rural areas, from the provinces. And it's just what I'm saying, as you can tell, I think in Dr. Zhivago, he does a good job of kind of revealing Marxist dogma as being something of the urban elites, rather than of the people themselves.
Yes, I that's definitely clear. One thing you also see is that with some of the other characters, they're not very major characters, but the one rabble rouser that's in the unit that in the unit that deserts. One thing is he says that at the end that he's going to abandon his family and go off and join the Red Guard. And for them, or there's another man that he meets later who says it's during the Civil War when they've shot a bunch of white soldiers, and they go up to see that they're new cadets from a military academy, guys who are 17, 18 years old. And Zhivago, one thing we should get into with him is that he's somebody who he genuinely does care about people. He's someone that actually genuinely does want the best for humanity and for for Russian society. And like he's heartbroken when he sees this young man lying on the field dead in a civil war. And I think that the guy makes a comment like, "You get what he got what he deserved." And Zhivago replies, "Have you ever loved a woman?" And the man replies, I used to have a wife and 4 children." So what you see with this guy is like I think that what you see with a lot of the Bolsheviks in the movie is that they've given up the things that actually would make their lives happy, their families, their country, their children, for the concept of utopia, for the dream of a utopia that of course never comes. But in like their attempt to create that perfect society, they destroy the things that actually do make people happy.
Yeah, I mean, an interesting bit is when Zhivago goes back to Moscow, and he comes from a quite well-to-do family. They are upper class and well off, and so this, of course, is a nice touch from Pasternak, because it means they're on the chopping block essentially. Like they're in Moscow, they're rich. They're doctors, they're professionals, they've got a very big house. So this, like, Moscow is the very last place that you want to be. But they're also quite soft and they're quite comfy, nice people. And then when Zhivago returns, and there's like 100 people inside of the house, and you've got this, let's be honest, like this retard from the Bolshevik party and they say, like, we've got like 30 families in here now where there used to be just one. And Zhivago, you can see that he kind of thinks that through, because they've lost their home. There's just strangers all over the house now, and they're all dossing down in it. And the actual people who own the house, his step-parents and his wife, they have been relegated to some little room in the middle of nowhere, while the whole house just gets trashed. Now, I thought that was interesting, because what the Marxists, the communists, have put to them there is like, why should all of these people freeze outside when you have all of this space? And I think it's interesting what would the counter argument to that be? Because he's going to have to say, well, they're just going to have to freeze. And if the problem is, if you're an open-hearted person, that's going to be quite hard to do. And this is what Zhivago seemed to be wrestling with. Like, yeah, I suppose it makes sense, but I mean, if he disagreed, they'd probably shoot him.
Yeah, and I do always think of that scene, like when he first walks into the house, and they're basically this like old cat lady hag and this new party man are lecturing him. I do kind of feel like this is the things that would be going through Zhivago's head are the things that goes through every white guy's head who works for a Fortune 500 company today while he's going through diversity training with the HR department. Like they just have all this ideology, just which basically tells him he's scum, you're horrible, and he has no choice but to basically just nod along with it and say, yes, I support this too. But what it's also interesting to see, though, is that like they can pose to you that, well, why should you have a house for 13 families, but it's only for one. But then I think like later on you see the actual reality of you actually see the real reality of the system that they're creating, because and not only that, but just the way that they put ideology above any kind of objective truth. So Zhivago hears about typhus. There's typhus in the city. And he mentions this to the commissar, and then he says, there is no typhus in Moscow. Why? Because then that would prove that because then that would prove that they're not actually creating a utopia if people are dying of typhus. And then I love the line later when there's a man who's literally dying in this house. He's about to die, and the commissar finally actually has to come to Zhivago to save the man, because he's going to die if he doesn't. And the line is great. He says, the commissar says to him, was it typhus? And Zhivago replies, no, he has another illness that doesn't exist in Moscow either, starvation.
Yeah. I mean, another thing is on the kind of, you can get 13 families in here. Zhivago goes out and he pulls a load of planks of wood off a fence. And because they're even in the house, it's cold. Like Moscow's a bloody cold place, as you know, I suppose. But the thing is that he steals some wood off this fence, and it's just there, just rotten. And he brings that back. But then it's pointed out that if he got caught doing that, his brother does it in a voiceover. And he says, well, if he got caught doing that, he'd be shot. And I thought this is funny because you can use the same argument that they used to basically take away the property rights of this rich family and just swamp the house with everybody off the street. You can also say, well, that wood on the fence could keep all of those people warm. Maybe 20 people could be kept warm for a night with the wood on that fence, which is doing nothing. So, but then the difference is it's like you're not taking the property rights away from the bourgeoisie. You're taking something from the state, because then the wood on the fence belongs to the state, and that you get shot for that, even though you can keep more people warm. So you can see that it isn't really about like taking care of people. It's just about power.
Yes, and what's interesting about the character of Yevgraf Zhivago, so this is Alec Guinness's character. He's Yuri Zhivago's half-brother. The story is told through the monologue of him. He's telling the story to the girl he thinks is the daughter of Yuri Zhivago and Lara, the long-lost daughter who never met him. But one thing that's interesting about him, about his character, is that he actually kind of reminds me of kind of a lot better of an aspect of the left. Now, I mean, I think that someone like him probably would not be part of the Bolshevik Party in the actual history. Like, he is a much more Gentile version of socialism. It comes from a genuine wish to make life better for people. But the difference with him is he actually does care about the flesh and blood of the people, because he says in that monologue that, I should shoot, according to the party line, I should shoot Zhivago for stealing that wood from the fence. But he can't fault a man for bringing firewood for his family in the middle of winter.
But he does, as he says that, he also says that he shot good men for less, and that he also says he's shot better men than himself. So he is in a way, he's kind of like more like a Kamarovsky. I mean, but he veers towards doing the good. Do you know what I mean? He's kind of in a world as harsh as the one they live in. You do have to be a bit of a realist, and this is what the Zhivago isn't. He's just away with the pixies all of the time.
With Yevgraf, what I wrote about him in my notes is that his politics are tribal, as in, this other group. His politics are from that group, but his soul is European. His soul is Russian. What's interesting about him is that he is also he basically is the one that saves Yuri, because the noose is around his neck in Moscow. He's a hated man. He's by the party because of his poetry. As they say, it's petty bourgeois. What's the exact line? Petty bourgeois
sentimentality.
Petty bourgeois sentimentality. But what he finds is that he actually really likes his brother's poetry, and he has sympathy on him for that alone. I mean, he says even that he was my blood, but only half of that. And one of his motivations for saving his brother, not only that they're partially related, it's that he actually genuinely thinks that his poetry is good. And one thing that's interesting is that before Yuri goes off into exile in the Urals, against all of his political loyalties to the Bolshevik Party, his brother keeps a copy of Zhivago's poetry for himself. And I kind of think that this is like an instance of humanity and goodness, and the Russian spirit shining through communism and shining through all the ideology and all the inhumanity that such an era brought.
Yeah, and I think especially when the family go to the Urals and they've got this lovely little cottage and they're planting their food again, and it's strange because you get this feeling like this is how life should actually be, and it's one in which ideology doesn't actually intrude. It's just going back to the land and living a natural life. But you also at the same time get this feeling that they're on borrowed time. and that it is just a matter of time before they find them. And that, you know, you've got Strelnikov going around in his train just wiping out villages, and then the sort of last sequence on the little cottage getaway, the little Heidi cottage, is where they know that time is really running out, and it's just Zhivago and Lara. And then Lean, I don't know if it's in the book, but Lean does a beautiful touch where he's got like wolves, packs of wolves, like actual wolves, are outside surrounding the cottage, howling in the middle of the night. And so it's this symbolic way to say, you know, you've had it good here for a long time, but the predators are on the way. Like this is the way it's going to go. The wolves are literally at the door.
I would say that, yeah, that his life in that cottage for the summer and winter that he's there, I mean, that probably is the ideal. That probably is just the environment which he thrives in the most, and you know, he was probably the most happy in. He's there with his stepfather, his wife, and their one child and their child to be. Unfortunately, he first of all, he cheats on his wife, but also he is eventually swept up into the Civil War. He's conscripted by Red partisans who find him, know that he's a doctor, and take him along, which he spends the next 2 years involved in the Civil War. But yeah, I mean, I'd say that you know, one of the best critiques that the film actually has of the entire system is that you know, escaping it kind of is where you can actually find the authentic life, that life in the village where he's growing his own crops, and or even like just at home staring out the window, out the frost of the window. That's kind of the good life, and it's the ideology, it's the materialism that the kind of intellectualism from Moscow, that's what it wants to destroy. It wants to destroy that genuine, authentic life where he's actually able to actually experience the things that he thinks gives lives meaning, the transcendentals that he writes about in his poetry. Another character I actually thought was interesting. He's not a major character, but the stepfather, because I thought with Zhivago's stepfather, so he's Tanya's father. They adopted Zhivago after his father died, and he arranges for them to be married. You know, after Zhivago eventually becomes a graduated doctor. I thought of him kind of as he resembled the old Russian order. He resembled the order of Imperial Russia. He was strongly loyal to the Tsar. There's a scene where you know, one of their servants who used to work for them, you know, when they arrive in the small village in the Urals, this man greets them, and he's happy to see him. He hands them a letter, and his name is Alexander. So Alexander, he's absolutely heartbroken when he hears that the Tsar has been executed. He's a very aristocratic man, but he's also one with a good heart, and he sees himself as having a duty to both his patients and wider Russian society. But what you see with him, though, is toward the end, I think, where someone like Zhivago can actually survive in the Soviet era, there's no room in Russia for a man like Alexander after, and eventually him and Tanya flee to Paris at the end of the movie, and never to return. So what would you say about the character of Alexander?
Well, yeah, it's very interesting how I think whether it's Pasternak or Lean, we're going to go with Lean because I haven't read the book, but there's a kind of fast one pulled at the early stages, because you do see all of the upper class, all of the bourgeoisie sitting around in very swanky restaurants where they've got songs and music playing in the background. They're listening to Rachmaninoff, and they're all done up in their ties. And then out on the streets, you do actually have poor people who look very hungry, look destitute. And you do kind of think, well, yeah, this maybe something should be done about it. But then when you actually zoom in on Alexander, he is like this lovable old duffer. And you kind of, it's very clever what's happened there, because on the one hand, at the start, you're thinking, well, maybe the people in the street have a point, because they're all out there in the snow, like, you know, cold and hungry. And here you've got all of these upper class people living at large inside of this swanky hotel, listening, quaffing wine. But then you realize that that's at the top. But when you shatter that, what you bring in is something which is just grotesque. And so then when we go to Alexander, you get the chance to zoom in on life as it actually is, where he is highly intelligent and posh and well educated. But the hierarchy means that the servant, the little gardener, who runs around after him at the cottage and brings him his newspaper, whatever, the local, the local kind of peasant, you can see that there's an ordered society still exists there, where everybody has their own place and everybody's kind of settled. And it's then, well, like you were saying, when the peasant brings the news that the Tsar, the royal family, has just been wiped out, that then the peasant as well as the upper class Alexander are equally as shattered by that news. So it is this idea where they're going to the conflict doesn't actually exist in the way that the Bolsheviks thought it did. I think that's what the message is being sent there, where people talk about traditional societies and hierarchies, and what you'll find is that they are like all settled in the same place. But the Bolsheviks would prefer it that the gardener was like jumping around with joy that the Tsar was killed, when of course he wasn't. He was horrified by it, because that's also his place in the world and his settled life being turned upside down. And for what? They're not going to offer him any kind of rootedness. They're not going to offer him, say, the beauty of Zhivago's poetry or anything. All he gets is a share of the spoils of somebody else's house. It's in this, like a bit of an extra loaf of bread or something. I certainly wouldn't have ended up materially any better. And that's the only thing that those people had to sell.
Yeah, and what you see with the other thing that's interesting with the character of Alexander is that his love for, I think that his love for other people, just like Zhivago's, is actually genuine. He's actually, like, the thing with Alexander is he actually is more of an explicit supporter of traditional Russian society, of the Tsar and of the Russian Empire. He actually is like a supporter of that, whereas Zhivago is a bit disconnected from politics. But you do really see that the good nature of Alexander at the beginning, when when Lara's mother tries to commit suicide because of hearing of the shameful affair that her daughter has had with Kamarovsky. Kamarovsky sends to Alexander, and he's in the middle of a performance at his house. He's hosting this like grand dinner where they're having this amazing piano performance, and his son is his stepson Zhivago and his daughter are going to be married. They're not related, so it's not like any incest, if anyone's wondering. And then he drops all that and goes straight to the house to save Lara's mother. So I think that his character does actually resemble a kind of goodness that exists in traditional hierarchical societies like that of the Russian Empire. And I do think that one of the things about communism that, and this is another dicey topic, is that it really is an outsider looking in at another society and then trying to rework it from there. So, they can look up and see, well, there's a man like Alexander who has this grand house. And then there's this, like you mentioned, this gardener who's poor. But, ultimately, like, from the people that actually live in that, it actually is not a bad order to live in. Of course, it's not equal, but I think that it is one that offers stability.
But it's one that's very difficult to defend in material terms, so you have to reject that entire philosophy completely out of hand. Another kind of, which is similar to this, is what I think is, except for the Lara rape, the most shocking scene. And I don't know why it shocks me so much, but there's a scene when they're on the front, and what's happened is basically, and it's Alec Guinness's character as well as a younger man, and they're at war with the Germans. So this is on the sort of the German-Russian front of World War I. And the Bolsheviks are spreading sort of pamphlets around, and what they're doing is telling the Russian soldiers to just revolt against the commanding officers, that they've got no quarrel with the Germans. What they should really do is go back to Moscow and march on their own elites. So this is the Bolsheviks are constantly stirring, and they actively want the Russians to lose the war as well. They're stirring up all of this trouble on the front lines with the soldiers. And what happens is the commanding officers arrive. It's like a general and his lieutenants or whatever. And then the men revolt against the commanding officers, and one of them, like a captain or something, stands on a barrel which is frozen water, and he's telling the men, like, he's trying to give them these sort of patriotic speeches as to why they should. He's saying the Germans are just a few miles down the road and they're coming for you. You're going to have to stand and fight, which, in terms of defending Mother Russia, he is right. Like, he is right. But what the Bolsheviks have done is sow this discord so that the Russian soldiers, they just don't care anymore. Because the Germans aren't the real enemy. The enemy is their own elites. And what happens is the man falls through the barrel, which is like frozen water, and all the soldiers laugh. Like, and it's this kind of comedy moment. And then one of them just pulls a gun out and shoots him when he's in the barrel. So what turns from a sort of light-hearted moment of comedy becomes something quite horrible, because it's the way like the laughing just turns to, well, he's dead, he's been shot, and the laughing stops. And then they pull the old general off his horse and beat him in the face to death with the butts of their rifles. And so for the first time, you get the impression that this is something very, very dark is coming here. Like the traditional mores, the morality, this is alien, completely alien.
Yeah, one correction I need to make is someone pointed out in the chat. I accidentally mixed up the medical professor with the stepdad, so they are separate characters. I apologize. I didn't catch that in the film. My mistake. But no, I still stand by what I said though. But yeah, in regards to that though, I think that one thing that leftism really offers people, it offers them the dream. It's always like that. It's a problem with human institution. It's always that, there's a great line by Solzhenitsyn that, the line that divides good and evil doesn't divide good men from bad, but it cuts down the center of every human heart. They have this idea that, if we just got rid of the bad people, we just got rid of the non-believers, we just destroyed all human institution, which is upholding this so-called unequal society, then we're going to have this great utopia where, everyone's wants and needs are going to disappear and they're all going to be satisfied with life. But it really just never is the case, because I think that they're just fundamentally incorrect about human nature. In basically every society, traditions matter, heredity matters, culture matters, and it's not something that they can just that's not something you can just throw away. And then the default is utopia. That's kind of always the selling point that the left has, is that we just need to deconstruct everything, tear everything down, and the default is good, when that just has been proven to never be the case.
I mean, I think for me, the line which is the most damning of the entire communism, the entire system that we're seeing being set up here, is when Alec Guinness's character, I cannot even pronounce his name, but when his character, so what happens is they found a girl in working, and they think it may well be the daughter of, this is like decades later, about 20 years later, I think. And it's Alec Guinness thinks he might have found the daughter of Zhivago, who's his half-brother, and Lara. Because she says, I'm carrying Zhivago's child, as they separate. We can come on to that moment a bit later. But then Alec Guinness kind of ponders, she asks whatever happened to Lara. And he says, we don't really know. More than likely, she just got worked to death in a work camp somewhere out in Siberia. And it's then your jaw drops, because for the last, and it comes right at the end as well. So for the last 3.5 hours, you've been on this huge, sprawling, epic romance. And at the heart of it all has been this beautiful woman who's kind of, she's not perfect, she's enigmatic. And then to have it where, well, she just maybe died in a name, she's buried in a nameless grave among tens of thousands of others that were busy building a railroad across some remote stretch of Siberia. That's how her story ended.
just completely anonymous, just another statistic which probably got lost in a file cabinet somewhere. But yet what we've seen is the huge story around that woman and all the men in her life and all of the traveling and the heartache, the loves and the losses and all of this. And because of the system because of communism, that woman that was at the heart of this grand saga, this great tragedy, ends up just being, a statistic in a file which gets lost somewhere in the bureau of the railwork network or something, and it's just utterly meaningless. And it says everything about when you try and construct an entire way of life, which is just pure intellect and no heart, which is everything that's wrong with how we live in the West today, to be honest. But then also that's why Pasternak used the poetry of Zhivago. It's like there has to be some sort of metaphysical meaning to life. You can't just treat people the way that the communists did. It's alien and satanic and sick. And the way they put that across brilliantly, in my view, is to say, well, this woman and all of these stories, all of these characters that you know now, and you followed them on this journey, the woman at the heart of it all is just a statistic in a file in a cabinet somewhere that'll be forgotten in a little office out in the woods.
And when I first saw the film, I don't think I fully understood it. The first time I saw it, I think that was in 2013, and this was kind of in my normie conservatism, classic liberal days. Because when that was like I first became interested in politics, and that was the first thing that was given to me. I thought that the film was too soft on communism. I thought that it was going too soft on the Bolsheviks and on the Bolshevik Revolution, and I thought it was too hard on. It didn't do enough it didn't do enough to fully criticize that. But I think I was actually incorrect, because I was expecting some kind of Reaganite era criticism of communism, something about like the economy or something like that, about how they don't understand markets, or that people were materially poorer. But I think that the critique of communism is actually a lot deeper than that. It's not coming from because the film came out in the 1960s, and this was a lot of people's interpretation of it as well. They thought that Zhivago seemed really like disconnected from the really huge historical events going on around him. And they felt that it kind of trivialized the events. But I think that isn't actually what David Lean was going for. And rather than a classic liberal, conservative, mid to late 20th century critique of communism, it's actually a much more reactionary critique of communism. And it's not necessarily about the politics or the economics of it. It's about really what it does to the soul. The fact that someone like Zhivago, who's not even really very political, he's not very interested in the politics. He's not a huge supporter of the Tsar. He's not, and he certainly is not a Bolshevik or anything like that. His kind of way of looking at the world, his way of finding truth, goodness, and beauty in the world around him, and then expressing that through poetry, that's actually a lot more dangerous to a materialistic worldview, which really all it really offers people is just more stuff. I mean, the utopia they envision is just where you're going to have more stuff to go around, and I mean that with someone like Zhivago, he sees value in the transcendental, and communism actively seeks to crush that, and goes with globalism and leftism today. And I think that actually is a lot more dangerous, and for that reason, I think it's actually a much better critique of communism than I originally realized.
Yeah, it is. I mean, it's funny because Kamarovsky's a capitalist. Kamarovsky's a business owner, and he's also highly intelligent. So just as what you were getting at there, he should be more of a threat to the Bolsheviks than Dr. Zhivago is. Because, as we say, Zhivago isn't even very political. He's just a romantic. And yet they're more worried. I mean, Kamarovsky ends up working for them. He slips directly into that mode. And they're more concerned about a poet
or somebody like when he's on the cattle truck in the train and driving all across Russia, and you can see like he'll open the little hatch and he gets his son, and they're staring up at the moon because it's a beautiful moonlight. And there's like endless amounts of examples of this. That he's got this romanticism to him, and yet the Bolsheviks are more concerned about that than what they are with a successful capitalist, because at the end of the day, the capitalist is a materialist as well, and he can just be given a fancy position and a bit of power, and he seems to slip straight into that mode. But they've got much like another example would be so the priests got massacred by them. They're much more worried about people who believe in truth and goodness and beauty, who have this kind of romantic soul. That's much more of a threat to their system than what capitalism is in the end.
Yeah, with the scene with Zhivago on the train, so basically they're going to the Urals and they're like packed into this absolute shithole of a train. A lot of people are being deported for forced labor. They're forced to spend weeks in this dirty, stinking train compartment cramped together with like 50 people. Zhivago, Alexander, Tanya, and their son. And what's interesting, like he opens the train window, like you mentioned. Like one thing is that, believe me, I've been to the Ural Mountains before. And this was actually shot in Banff, Alberta, not in Canada, which I've been there too. Believe it's freezing out there in the winter. It's like minus 20 degrees Celsius, and if you open that, like, yeah, it's not going to be it's not going to be very pleasant. And the other passengers on the train, they hate him for it. Like they're like, close the damn window. What the heck are you doing? But yeah, like I think like with Zhivago, just like staring out at the moon or just staring out at the landscape, he sees beauty in that. And like I mentioned, like almost the entire movie, he actually seems like he is happy, which is incredible. And even in the scene when like he's been conscripted into the Red Army, and this is where he's at the absolute worst. He looks like he's about to fall over dead from frostbite any second. Like he's covered in all these frozen blankets, and his beard is frozen. He's absolutely miserable. But then he looks up even at that one point, he just looks up at the sky from the clouds and over the landscape. And even then you kind of get the sense that he sees something poetic in the absolute worst of situations. And yeah, I think that's kind of why it is like a much better critique of it's much better critique of communism in that regard. But also, it's important for us to know today that people really focus on culture. The you-know-whos, and we all know who we're speaking about, the people who are very represented in the Bolshevik Revolution. They made very strong efforts to absolutely gut the Russian soul. Everything about traditional Russian society, absolutely like smash it on the ground. Because that if you're going to try to force people into this materialistic bureaucratic system under which they're subjugated, you have to destroy everything that gives their lives meaning. And I think that's why people, a lot of them involved that are part of the same group, are so enthusiastic to do that today. That's why they will just go through. That's why a lot of them have colonized cultural institutions, Hollywood, and such, and gave you, and they want to tell you your story for you as a means of demoralizing you, because that ultimately is the linchpin that's going to get someone. Those are the things that people fight and die for. It's not for a bigger apartment. It's not like so that you can have another piece of lumber to put into your furnace, or in today's standards, it's not so you can get a new iPhone. It's for those it's for those transcendental things.
There's a part on the train as well, where Klaus Kinski, I don't even know if he has a name. It's just like a small cameo that he has, and he's being taken off to like forced labor in Siberia, and he's on the train as well. And he watches Zhivago looking at the moon, and he bursts out laughing, and he goes on this kind of rant. And it's because he's aware of what Zhivago represents. He's aware that he's like an idealist. And he's kind of overcome that. Like he knows what he's doing when he's looking out at the moon, and he lets out this big laugh and has this little kind of speech about how pathetic it all is, and that it's all over, it's all finished now. It'll be just purely a materialist paradigm that everybody is going to live in. This is the future. But the problem is they've never been able to keep a lid on it.
Yeah, he's like the one who's given up all hope. That character has a short cameo. He's the one. He's like the black pilled one. He's like the guy that you'll get on Twitter today. That anytime you post something, he's the right wing guy that anytime you post something, it's like, oh no, the genocide is coming, and he'll like retweet African snuff films all day long.
Yeah, it's like this kind of nihilist outlook. It's all lost. And like they've won, it's all lost. You may as well just deal with it. Why are you staring at the moon like you cook? It's like, what are you going to write a poem about it? And this kind of cynical attitude that just drags everybody down. But it doesn't. It's just a dead end. It's just this nihilistic. And I hate the word. I'm tired of everybody saying it, but it's a cope.
Yeah, I mean, the other thing is it's kind of similar to. I mean, you see this a lot today. It's like the outrage cycle, the constant, like what we call it online, the decline porn. It's the basking in the situation. But I think like a character, he's kind of like the opposite of Zhivago, whereas he's someone that he's internalized the entire thing. Zhivago is the one who actually is able to walk through that and maintain a healthy soul. I just want to read out a super chat. So if you'd like to send any super chats, any questions for Morgoth and I, you can on Entropy. It's linked down below. Yeah, this is about the score of the movie. So it says, for me, Lean's coupling with Maurice Jarre is exemplary musical score for both Lawrence of Arabia and Dr. Zhivago is what makes both these movies. The score for both is near perfection. It near perfect compliments. Yeah, so the score is fantastic in this movie as well. It really puts you in the emotional mood for what Zhivago is looking at. I do wonder what the movie would be like if you didn't have the music and you had like the picture of Zhivago just staring out the window. It wouldn't be the same.
Is that like that? The whole, if you took the music out of it, you'd spend about an hour and a half watching a man like shiver in the cold. In the snow, like that's what it would be. It's interesting to point out as well that Omar Sharif played Dr. Zhivago, and what do you think about the casting of Omar Sharif? Because he isn't Russian by any stretch of the imagination, and it isn't. You got to remember it's 1965. It isn't sort of diversity casting or anything like that. I think it's just because Omar Sharif was a breakout star of Lawrence of Arabia, and David Lean wanted to kind of get him in on this one as well. But I'm not sure. I mean, they also whitened his skin and made him look more Russian, more white and European, because he's Egyptian, of course. He was.
Yeah, I mean, he certainly has a great performance. I certainly like his. I certainly like his portrayal as Zhivago. I mean, there's only one scene where you kind of start to see, like, this isn't actually a Russian guy. You can kind of see that he's Egyptian. It's the scene when he's in bed with Lara the second time. And I gotta say that one scene was kind of like it was reminiscent of the advertisements we see today. That's what I thought about.
I know. I never realized he was an Arab until he was in bed with a white woman. All of a sudden, you become conscious of what it is that you're watching.
Yeah, but I do like the character. He definitely, I definitely think his performance is good. I like Alec Guinness as Yevgraf as well. I don't know. He does feel like a very stoic man, a man who's like very he's of course very committed to communism, but at the same time he actually does seem like someone that in the new system, the character he seems like someone who in the new system actually would be a force for good. Of course, it's not an ideal system, but even then he does seem like he's a good man and someone who could bring some good to society after the revolution.
I'm just checking on Wikipedia for Omar Sharif's background because there's people saying he was actually Greek. He's a family of Lebanese descent. He and his family belong to a small ethno-religious minority known as the Antiochian Greek Christians. All right, so I can see what's happened there. So that's interesting. I actually thought he was Egyptian. Well, it is a bit of a hodgepodge and mix when you get down to that part of the world, I suppose.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
What I'll say about the music as well, because what do you call the guitar thing? The balalaika?
Balalaika, yeah.
Yeah, so that acts as a kind of
it plays with the music well because that's what the music is playing. But then the music also emphasizes it's called Lara's theme, the main tune that everybody thinks of with Dr. Zhivago. So you've got her as that because she is the muse of the whole film, really. But then I think it also does a good job of like just giving you that atmosphere that you're just wandering in the world, because one of the themes of this is being uprooted and kind of cast out into the wild, wandering world. It happens to all of the characters in the movie, in fact. And they then, like, 2 years will pass and they'll just mysteriously bump into each other, or somebody will just happen to be in the right place at the right time, kind of thing. But then on top of that, you've got the balalaika, which is it kind of gets passed down. It starts off with Zhivago as a small boy, and he inherits it, and then it gets passed down all the way to his daughter as she's wandering off with her boyfriend, and Alec Guinness kind of nods, and he makes a little comment about whether she can play the balalaika. Now, at this point, this is at the end, and we're into Stalin's Russia, and they've just completed this gigantic hydro dam, and again, it's this little thing where so the balalaika is that romantic soul, and he makes a little point that even now, even after decades, there's still this need for something outside of Marxist materialism, that it still exists and it's been passed down this family for generations now, just like a little flower being held alive in the desert.
Yeah, and that's actually something I wanted to get into too, because one thing I think about the Soviet era in Russia, and for anyone who doesn't know, I've actually lived in Russia before. I've spent lots of time there, so I've been able to actually engage with that culture as it exists today, and get a lot of people's intake on the communist era. Now, one thing that's interesting to note is that a lot of people in Russia today, a lot of the older people, they're actually very nostalgic for the Soviet years. And one thing that I think that a lot of people might take this the wrong way. I want to make it clear, I'm no communist. I'm no fan of communism, and I think that all the positives I'm going to mention are in spite of communism, not because of it. But I do feel like, especially in the later Soviet era, after the you-know-whos had largely declined in power in the Soviet Union, there actually was somewhat of a good culture that actually developed. There is a kind of jolliness to the Soviet culture that developed in the mid to late 20th century. And I feel that what that is kind of, humanity shining through the ideology, really. And I don't think that that's impossible to do. But, one thing this may be a bit of a black pill. I think that's a lot harder to do today in the system that the West is governed under right now than it is than it would be through the Soviet Union, because at the same time there was there still was the same people there. They still were genetically Russian, and of course that's the real target of our enemies today. But what would you say to that? Like, it does seem like when you look at the Soviet years, it does seem like there is actually some good culture, legitimately good culture, that was produced in the USSR that, despite it all, was actually able to shine through.
Yeah, you can absolutely look at some of the opera houses, and what you'll find is that as you say, there's a traditional European identity underneath the socialism, which still existed underneath this kind of bad system. But it's in the West, it's the opposite. In the West, they're rotting us from the inside, whereas that kind of kernel, that cultural soul, seemed to survive in Russia, and it was just a matter of getting rid of what this sort of coating of communism and Marxism around it, this ideological coating around the poetic and the balalaika. Whereas in the West, it's hit us in the other way. They got that economic form and the state totalitarianism, and then the spirit of the nation was still there underneath it all. What they've done what's happened in the West is that they've gone straight for the spirit. So you end up where externally you're free, though this is now under, seems to be a bit laughable these days, but superficially you're free, but what's happening is that they're rotting your soul out. So it's like an inversion of what happened in the Soviet Union. And I know, like, people say this is kind of like a normie-con take, where it's like, you're just comparing what's happening in the West to the Soviet Union. Well, no, not really, because I don't think it's about communist czars and the ideologues, though I do think it's the urban intellectual imposing himself and his bullshit ideologies on the people in the shires and in the provinces. That's the same thing, but the form of it is completely different. They're rotting our soul out, whereas in the Russian it was just coated in something ugly and repulsive, but it was still there underneath.
Yeah, there's the famous Jonathan Bowden quote, "Communism breaks the body, liberalism rots the soul." The other thing that I was wondering, though, is, Dr. Zhivago, I mean, he's a character whose his body is broken, his life is broken throughout that, but his soul remains healthy. I do wonder, though, in modern society, would that actually even be possible? I mean, I do think, today you can still take a walk in the park, you can still go to a countryside, you can still visit with your family, and of course you can have a lot of good, authentic experiences with it still in this modern world. But I do think, though, like, in the heart of it, because like someone like the character of Yuri Zhivago, at the end of the movie, just before he dies, he's like a bum on the street in post-revolutionary Moscow. He's lost Tanya, he's lost Lara, he has nothing, and the last he gets is to work his brother to get him a job in his old hospital, just where he started decades earlier. And that's the end of it. But despite it all, he remains a happy person, even in that situation. I do wonder, could you actually maintain that if you were like if you were like the stuck in living in like a London or Toronto pod, eating bugs, and all you have to do all day is with Netflix and Marvel movies? That would be a lot more difficult, I would think.
But you're not allowed that kind of idealism to begin with. I mean, it's kind of depressing, but what would Lara be like? Would it be like a lesbian or something? Like because at least it's Dr. Zhivago is rooted in traditional forms. It's she's a beautiful woman and all of the men want to have her. It's a traditional love story. There's war. It's set in this. It's like modernist, but in the postmodern era, those certainties have all been turned to liquid. So it all kind of becomes this incoherent mush till the very end. Zhivago, like, he literally drops dead of a heart attack on the street, but it's still like a traditional love that he has for a beautiful woman, which I can relate to. But this, even as a concept in the postmodern West, barely even exists anymore. People will just say it was cringe.
Yeah, I mean, that's the problem, is that, like, we can't even have that sincerity anymore because of like ironism and just the lot that people don't even really take these things seriously anymore. One quote from Greg Johnson that he gave in a speech was that today nobody could express like love for a woman the way that someone would have like a century ago. Like, he said that there's no way to say I love you madly without sounding like a complete without that sounding cringe, without that sounding disingenuous. So it's something that like ironism just immediately breaks down. I guess like the question though is like how do you actually kind of recapture that? How do you actually recapture the spiritual in modern society? Because like we said, like it was possible in the Soviet Union for some, and it is important. It is also interesting to note that like I mentioned, the novel and the film were banned in Russia for several decades after it was written. Today, Dr. Zhivago is a very popular film in Russia. A lot of my friends there know the film and love it, and it kind of is an instance of art. It is an instance of art, kind of reality following art. That in the film, Zhivago's poetry is banned because it's considered a petty bourgeois sentimentalism. But then what it shows in the film is that at Zhivago's funeral, the guy was basically a no one when he died. There's a bunch of people that showed up and put flowers on his grave because, as the line that Alec Guinness's character says, no one loves poetry like a Russian. And I just wonder that, like, is there actually a way to recapture some kind of like to actually recapture that like poeticness that someone like Zhivago would in the modern world when I think it's a lot more robust in suppressing that today. And how would you go about doing that?
You'd have to find like so if we juxtapose Zhivago's romantic ideals and his poetry, his just this his just the way he is, and you kind of pit that against the soulless Strelnikov, horrible materialist Bolshevism, you can see why they're worried about it. So because one was an antithesis to the other. So what is that? What is that today in the West? What is the opposite of globo homo? And what is globo homo most worried about? I mean, another thing that I think is interesting is that if you look at the Soviet Union and you've got Solzhenitsyn and you've got Pasternak, but in Russia in general, Russia's well known for having these authors, Tolstoy and Dostoevsky and so on, for launching these like really powerful broadsides or revealing something deep or saying something really deep about the Russian soul, like say Dostoevsky did, who in The Devils at least kind of predicted this. It was kind of like this would have been like 60 years or so before. I think he wrote that in like 1870s, and he was predicting that there was too much Western materialism and intellectual thinking coming into Russia, which was godless, and that eventually it was going to lead to something horrible, which of course it did. But the thing is, you've got all of these like big names, big Russian names, and when you look at people like Pasternak or Solzhenitsyn, they become these kind of icons of Russian identity itself and what they have got to say about Russia. But like, who is the equivalent of that in the West doing that now? Who is writing the polemic? And I'm not talking about, people on the internet, like serious intellectuals. Where is the serious polemic being delivered against the modern Western liberalism as we live now? It certainly isn't someone like Douglas Murray or, these kind of people who jump on the bandwagon of kind of a light criticism, but fundamentally they're still rooted in it. They're still rooted in the pause themselves. Like, where does that come from and how does it happen? Why don't we have that tradition in the West? And it seems as if the criticisms just don't seem to appear like that in the way, and I don't know why that is.
Yeah, and what you mentioned is that like Russia is famous for all these writers, these poets and authors. One thing that I can confirm myself is that the Russians today are a lot more rooted in their traditional culture than anyone in the West is. I am fully convinced that 70 years of communism didn't do nearly as much damage to their culture as 70 years of neoliberalism has to the cultures in the West, because you can speak to people today and they still know who Dostoevsky is. They've still read Dostoevsky, they've still read Lev Tolstoy, and a lot of them love films like Dr. Zhivago. I'll always remember that there was this Ukrainian woman that I knew when I was living in Toronto. She moved from Kharkov to Toronto, and one thing that she said to me was that this movie called Barber of Siberia, she says it captures the Russian soul. And, as someone who was like not really used to thinking of things like that, this is something that, people like us on the internet now think of. But like, this is a woman who is not very political at all. She probably couldn't tell you the first thing about, economic policy or anything like that, or even any of the concepts we're talking about, or like the Enlightenment or liberalism. She knows nothing about that. But she was so much more rooted in a real, genuine culture than anyone I had ever met in from Canada, and it just goes to say a lot about. I guess I don't think it says a lot about communism. It says a lot about just how much worse neoliberalism really has been for the soul.
Yeah, it came out the other day where you've got this pop scientist who said that science can now prove that the humans have no soul. This English former pop star called Brian Cox. So even to talk in those terms is kind of
We don't know how to do it yet. After communism in Russia, they can still unironically talk about the Russian soul as healing, or there's this particular folk song and it expresses the Russian soul. We've lost even the language to begin to describe that stuff. If I went on a certain Twitter thread or something, and I started to speak about the English soul, then it's like, well, first of all, there's no such thing as soul. You believe in sky fairies, but then also, by the way, what is English? There's no such thing as English. English is just a passport. So everything's just been turned into gloop. Like they use the rainbow flag, but it's all of the colors just running into each other, because all forms are just turned to liquid. And that's the difference between what's happening to the West and what happened to the Russians, which is explored in Dr. Zhivago.
Yeah, and I was trying to think of like what would be a Canadian equivalent or any kind of equivalent, of that, from the West today. And the only thing I could come up with was the one movie Passchendaele. And there's not that many Canadian movies out there, but most of them I've seen have been pretty crap. The one that I really liked, though, was the film Passchendaele. Now, it does have a bit of political correctness crammed in there, but I just love the scenes of them riding through Alberta and riding through like the canyons and the plains in the scenes, because like the movie's about the Battle of Passchendaele, but most of it takes place in Calgary during the First World War. They ship off to France at the end. But that was like we don't have very many examples. I could only think of one that was anything equivalent to what something like Dr. Zhivago, even though it is an English movie, or anything like Dostoevsky or War and Peace is to Russians today. So I think that I wanted to finish with by telling people like why this movie is one that I really feel people should be watching today. Why it is one that's definitely worth watching. And I guess it kind of goes with what we're saying, is that it is a movie about maintaining one's own humanities through the worst of human tragedies. It's about maintaining that poetic love for all that is beautiful in the world in a time that really seeks to crush the soul. And I do think that the West is going through something very similar. I think when we wake up in the next few days, you can just look at Washington. There's troops on the streets in Washington. Nancy Pelosi's talking about whiteness. They're saying they're going to put every single Trump supporter on like a terrorist watch list or something like that. And it is very similar to the situation that, many Russians would have found themselves in after the Bolshevik Revolution. Like you mentioned, the soul rot is already there. Now it seems like the politics are actually coming in. And I think it is a very powerful film for the day and age that we're living in. What would you say about that?
Yeah, I do. And I think, there's I did a video on my channel last week where I was saying, well, what do you do? How do you react to this? And the general consensus seems to be that you kind of keep your head down, or at least don't take on the system in its current form, where they're totally hysterical, locking everybody up. Everybody's a terrorist. And what you'll find is that it does lend itself towards the sort of the Dr. Zhivago, maybe a mass movement of the Dr. Zhivago mentality is more crippling to a system. You got that thing where you take a clear pill, and it's where you kind of just go off and enjoy yourself and wait for it all to fall down. Because when you come down to it, that was kind of like Dr. Zhivago's approach. He was just sort of wandering around, enjoying the beauty of life, or at least trying to, but they're constantly making his life hard. But yeah, maybe that is where you have a completely different philosophical frame that the system can't deal with. Maybe that's the lesson of Dr. Zhivago. It's just that when it came out, nobody would ever think we could apply it to the West.
Yeah, and I think that's probably a good place to finish. Is there anything else you'd like to talk about tonight, Morgoth, or do you think we've done it justice?
No, I'm fine. I think next time maybe do the cartoon Watership Down and the themes and that. But I'll have a think over the next month. But we'll definitely be back next month on my channel.
All right. So thank you for listening, and make sure to check out the next stream that we do on Morgoth's channel in February. So Dr. Zhivago, great film. Highly recommended. 5 out of 5 stars. And, you know, if you're looking for anything to watch in these turbulent times, it's definitely worth it. So anyway, thanks for listening and have a good night, everyone.